He walked in without knocking. That was the first thing Amara noticed. Not the flowers, not the card tucked between the stems, not even the way the entire office had gone quiet the moment the door swung open. What she noticed first was that Kang Min-jae didn't knock. He never knocked on anyone's door except his own. And yet here he was, standing in the doorway of her small office like he owned the air inside it, which, technically, she supposed he did. His eyes went straight to the bouquet sitting on the corner of her desk. White flowers. 12 of them, arranged in a glass vase she didn't own yesterday. Someone had placed them there before she arrived. She'd spent the first 20 minutes of her morning staring at them, touching the card, reading the handwriting twice, smiling like an idiot when she thought no one was looking. Min-jae's jaw tightened. He crossed the room in 4 steps, picked up the entire vase, water, flowers, card and all, and walked out without saying a single word. Amara sat there with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth and watched him disappear. If you've ever had someone take something from you before you even understood what it meant, you know exactly how that feels. Not anger, not confusion, just this hollow stillness, like the moment after a door slams and the sound is still vibrating in the walls. That was the morning everything changed. And if you're watching this right now, I want you to ask yourself one thing. If the person you worked for, the person you had quietly, foolishly given 3 years of your life to, did that to you, what would you do? If this story sounds like something you'd want to follow all the way to the end, hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what comes after this morning is something none of us saw coming, not even Amara. Her name was Amara Brooks, and she was not the kind of woman people wrote stories about. She knew that. She'd always known that. You figure it out early when you're the only black woman in a Korean corporate building, when you're plus size in a world that rewards smallness, when you have a habit of knocking over your own coffee and apologizing to the mug afterward. You learn quickly that you are background, you are useful, you are the person who remembers where the files are and what time the car is supposed to arrive and which client can't be seated next to which other client because of a grudge that goes back 11 years. You are not the woman someone sends flowers to. Except someone had. Amara sat at her desk for a long moment after Min-jae left. The vase was gone. The flowers were gone. The card, that small folded card with the handwriting she'd already memorized, was gone too. All that remained was a damp ring on the corner of her desk where the vase had been sitting. She stared at it. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up Min-jae's afternoon schedule, because that was what she did. That was who she was. The world could tilt sideways and Amara Brooks would still have the schedule open by 9:15. She told herself she wasn't bothered. She was absolutely bothered. The flowers had arrived when she walked in that morning, a Tuesday, rainy, the kind of sole morning where the city felt like it was wrapped in wet newspaper. She'd been juggling her umbrella and her bag and a container of leftover rice she'd brought for lunch, and she'd pushed open her office door with her elbow, and there they were. White flowers, not roses. Something she didn't immediately recognize, with petals that curved inward slightly, fragile-looking, arranged in a simple glass vase like whoever sent them didn't need to impress anyone, just wanted her to see them. The card was tucked in on a small ivory envelope. She'd put down everything else before opening it, which told her something about herself she wasn't sure she wanted to examine. For the woman who makes ordinary days worth remembering. No signature, no name, just that one line in clean, careful handwriting. Amara had read it twice. Then she'd set it back against the stems and gone to make her coffee and stood in the break room for a full minute just holding her mug, feeling something embarrassingly close to happy. That was before Min-jae walked in. He appeared at her doorway at 8:52, 3 minutes before he usually passed by her office on his way to the executive floor. He was already in his suit, charcoal gray today, no tie, top button open, which meant the morning meeting had been canceled and he hadn't fully transitioned into his public version yet. His hair was still slightly damp. He looked like a man who hadn't slept particularly well and was too proud to admit it. He looked at the flowers. His face did something complicated. Then he walked in, picked them up, and left. The whole interaction took less than 30 seconds. Amara didn't move until she heard the elevator doors close down the hall. Then she set down her coffee cup, very carefully, and said to her empty office, "Okay." She'd worked for Kang Min-jae for 3 years, 2 months, and roughly 16 days, though she'd stopped counting around the 8-month mark when she'd realized counting wasn't making it easier. It was making it weirder. The job had come through a placement agency, a legitimate one she'd checked 3 times, because nothing about the original posting had seemed legitimate. Personal executive assistant to a CEO. Fluent English required. Discretion essential. Salary listed in a range that made her refresh the page twice to make sure she hadn't misread it. She'd misread nothing. She'd worn her best blazer to the interview and practiced answers in the mirror and walked into the Baekryong Group Tower on a Thursday morning feeling like a woman who absolutely belonged there. The first person she met was a man named Director Lim, who looked her up and down with the specific expression of someone encountering a situation they hadn't planned for. He asked her twice if she was in the right building. He asked her once if she was applying for the cleaning staff position, which was listed on a different floor. Amara had answered every question with her hands folded in her lap, and her voice completely level, and her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. Then Min-jae had walked in. He hadn't looked her up and down. He hadn't done the reassessment thing that people did, that quick recalibration when they met her and decided she didn't fit whatever picture they'd formed. He'd sat down across from her with a folder he didn't open and asked her one question. "If I give you 2 contradictory instructions at the same time, what do you do?" Amara had thought about it for 3 seconds. She remembered exactly how long because she'd counted, and then said, "I ask you which one has the harder deadline and start there. Then I let you know when I'm switching." He'd looked at her for a moment. Then he'd said, "Start Monday." That was it. No other questions. Director Lim had looked like he'd bitten into something unexpected. Min-jae had stood up and left the room. She'd been hired in less time than it took to boil an egg. 3 years later, she understood the answer she'd given him was the only answer he'd ever actually needed. Min-jae's world was built on contradictions. Legitimate businesses layered over things she'd learned not to ask about directly. Schedules that changed without explanation. Meetings with men whose names never appeared on any official company register. He needed someone who didn't freeze when things didn't make sense. He needed someone who would just ask the practical question and get to work. He needed her. She knew that. She'd known it for a while. What she hadn't known, what she was still not entirely sure about, even now, even after 3 years, was whether he knew it. She was in the middle of rescheduling his 2 o'clock when the knock came. Not Min-jae. Min-jae didn't knock on her door anymore, apparently. He just materialized and took things. It was Yoon, one of the junior associates, a nervous man in his early 30s who always looked slightly apologetic for existing. He stepped inside without fully committing his body to the room, one foot still technically in the hallway. He said. "Yoon. Boss wanted me to—" He held out a folder. "Revised contracts for the Daejeon property. He wants your review notes by noon." Amara took the folder. "Tell him I'll have them by 11:30. Yoon lingered. His eyes drifted to the damp ring on her desk. He definitely noticed. The entire floor had probably noticed that Min-jae had walked into her office and walked out carrying flowers. And the entire floor was definitely not going to say a word about it to anyone because they'd all seen what happened to the last person who commented on something Min-jae did without being asked. "Anything else?" Amara said. "No," Yoon said, and left. Amara opened the folder and stared at the first page without reading it. She was thinking about the handwriting on the card. Clean, careful. Someone who wrote slowly, deliberately. Someone who chose words the way you chose a gift, with attention. For the woman who makes ordinary days worth remembering. She hadn't even known someone was paying attention to her days. The thought landed somewhere uncomfortable. Not painful. Just there. Like a stone in a shoe you'd gotten so used to you forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. The morning moved the way mornings at Baekryong always moved, in layers. Things happening on the surface, things happening underneath, and Amara's job was to manage both without letting either one spill into the other. She reviewed the contracts. She flagged 3 clauses she'd flag every time and that Min-jae would override 2 of and accept 1 of, which was their rhythm. She fielded a call from a logistics partner in Busan who spoke too fast and paused in the wrong places. She redirected a journalist who'd somehow gotten the main line. That happened once a month. She'd developed a script. And she ordered lunch for the 4th floor meeting that Min-jae had added to the schedule at 10:45 without telling her, which she'd discovered because she'd checked the meeting room bookings the way she always did at 10:30. She was good at this. She was genuinely, specifically, excellently good at this. It was one of the things she'd made peace with about herself. Not the peace of settling, but the peace of someone who understood her own capabilities clearly and didn't need applause for them. What she'd never quite made peace with was the other thing. The thing where she cared more than she was supposed to. It wasn't something she'd chosen. You don't choose that kind of thing. You're sitting across from a man at 11:30 at night because a deal went sideways and you're both exhausted and he's rubbing the back of his neck, the way he does when he's about 3 decisions away from doing something he'll regret. And you say the right thing. Not because you've calculated what the right thing is, but because you know him. You know him the way you know the layout of a room you've been in 1,000 times. And the thing you feel when he looks at you afterward is not professional satisfaction. You don't choose that. You just manage it. You fold it up small and put it somewhere you don't have to look at directly, and you go back to doing your job, because the job is real, and the other thing is a complication you can't afford. Amara was very practiced at this. She was doing it right now, in fact. She was very professionally, very competently reviewing property contracts, and absolutely not thinking about white flowers or clean handwriting or the fact that Min-jae had come into her office personally instead of sending someone. He could have sent someone. He never sent someone when it was something he wanted done a specific way. She pressed her pen hard enough to dent the paper and turned to the next page. Noon came. She submitted her notes 14 minutes early. At 12:40, her office door opened again. Not a knock. Footsteps she knew without looking up. Min-jae closed the door behind him. He didn't usually close the door. She set down her pen. He stood in the middle of her office, not at the desk, not near the window, just standing, like he'd walked in without a plan and was now deciding what the plan was. He had the look he got sometimes during negotiation that she privately called the underwater look, like he was still 3 layers deep in a thought and only the surface of him was in the room. "My notes are already submitted," she said. "If there's a problem with the Daejeon, there's no problem with Daejeon. Okay?" He didn't say anything. Amara waited. She was very good at waiting. It was one of the most important skills she'd developed in 3 years, knowing when Min-jae's silence meant he was about to say something and knowing when it meant he'd already decided not to. This one felt like the first kind. "Who sent them?" he said. Not a question. The tone of a man confirming information he already had. "I don't know," she said. "There was no name." His jaw moved slightly. "Did you read the card?" "Yes." "What did it say?" She held his gaze. "You read it before I could get it back." A beat. He didn't deny it. "The handwriting," she said carefully. "You recognized it." Nothing on his face confirmed it. Nothing denied it either. With Min-jae, the absence of denial was its own kind of answer. "I'd like the flowers back," Amara said. "Whatever you did with them. They're gone. They were mine." "Someone sent them to this building," he said, "to an address connected to Bae Kuryong, without going through the appropriate, they sent them to my desk, Min-jae." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "To me, not to the building, not to the company, to me. And I don't think you actually care about mail protocol right now." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly, just enough for her to catch. He didn't answer. "If there's a security concern," she said, moderating, "I understand that. Tell me what you need from me and I'll cooperate. But if this is something else, it's a security concern," he said. "All right. I need you to tell me if you receive anything else." "Of course." He nodded once, like something had been settled, like they'd just discussed the Daejeon contracts, and not the fact that he'd walked into her office, taken flowers off her desk, and was now standing in her space at 12:40 in the afternoon, looking like a man who hadn't finished the thought he'd come in to finish. He turned toward the door. "Min-jae." He stopped. Amara picked up her pen, looked back at her papers. "If there's a security concern," she said quietly, "why didn't you send someone to ask me about it? Why did you come yourself?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. Then she heard him open the door and leave. She sat with the question in the empty room. She hadn't expected an answer. She just needed to say it, to put it somewhere outside of herself where it could exist as a real thing rather than a loop in her head. The damp ring on her desk had dried completely. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to the next page of the afternoon schedule and got back to work. By 3 o'clock, she had heard from 4 different people on the floor. Not directly, none of them directly, but through the small signals that passed between people who worked in close proximity to someone powerful. A look from the receptionist. Yoon appearing in her doorway twice with questions that weren't actually questions. Even Director Lim, who communicated with Amara through narrowed eyes and strategic indifference, paused in the hallway outside her office longer than the hallway required. Something was moving through the building. She could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. She didn't know yet what kind of storm. At 3:40, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No country code she immediately recognized. I hope the flowers arrived safely. Jay. Amara stared at the screen. Then she opened her desk drawer and pulled out the small personal notepad she kept for things she didn't want on official channels. She wrote down the number, the time, the message, word for word. She sat back. Jay. She thought about the handwriting. For the woman who makes ordinary days worth remembering, careful, deliberate. Someone who had her personal number. Someone who knew where she worked, not just the company, but her specific office, her specific desk. Someone who'd arranged for flowers to be delivered before she arrived, which meant they knew her schedule. Her schedule. The ice that moved through her then was not the pleasant kind. She looked at the message again, looked at the flowers were not, looked at the damp ring on her desk. She thought about Min-jae's face when he'd walked in that morning. Not angry, exactly. Something underneath anger. Something with more weight than anger. She took a slow breath. Then she forwarded the message, number included, to Min-jae's private line. No explanation, just the screenshot. His reply came in 47 seconds. Come to my office. Now. Amara gathered her notepad and her pen, straightened her jacket, and stood up. The afternoon light through her window was the color of weak tea. Outside, the city moved in its usual indifferent way. Cars, people, rain-wet streets still gleaming from the morning. Seoul didn't slow down for anyone's private upheaval. It just kept going, the way cities do. She walked toward the elevator. She didn't know yet who Jay was. She didn't know yet what the flowers had started, but she knew Min-jae's reply had come in 47 seconds, and in 3 years, 2 months, and some days, she'd never once seen him respond to anything in under 2 minutes. Whatever this was, it had already reached him somewhere he didn't let things reach, and somewhere in the part of herself she kept carefully folded and small. Amara Brooks felt the first tremor of something she wasn't ready to name. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. The elevator opened on the executive floor, and the first thing Amara noticed was the quiet. Not the normal quiet of a floor where people were working and keeping their voices low. This was a different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when everyone in a room has been told, without words, to become invisible. 2 of Min-jae's men were stationed outside his office door. Not unusual, but they were standing differently than they usually stood. Closer to the wall. Eyes forward. The posture of men who'd been given a specific instruction recently and were still holding it. She walked past them without slowing down. One of them reached for the door and opened it before she could knock, which meant Min-jae had already told them she was coming, which meant he'd been watching the elevator feed, which meant he'd been watching for her specifically. She filed that away and walked in. The office was large and obsessively ordered. Everything in it cost more than her monthly salary and looked like it had never been touched by accident. One entire wall was glass, overlooking the Han River district, the city spread out below in its gray afternoon light. Min-jae was standing at that window with his back to her, his phone face down on the desk, his jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He didn't turn around when she entered. Close it, he said. She closed the door. The silence lasted long enough for her to cross the room and stand near the desk without being invited to sit. She didn't sit. She stood with her notepad against her side and waited because she knew this version of him. This was the version that needed a moment to organize something before it came out, and pushing it only made the organization worse. Finally, he turned around. He looked like he hadn't eaten since morning. There was something in his face she'd seen maybe 3 times in 3 years. A tightness around the eyes that wasn't anger and wasn't calculation, that she'd spent a long time trying to name and still hadn't quite managed. He held out his hand. Give me the notepad. She handed it over. He looked at what she'd written, the number, the timestamp, the message word for word, and his expression didn't change, but the line of his jaw did. Just slightly. Just enough. "You wrote it down before you sent it to me," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I didn't know what it was yet," she said. "I wanted a record that was mine, in case it became something official." He looked at her. "You thought about it being official before you came up here." "I think about contingencies. That's my job." Something moved through his eyes. He set the notepad on the desk without giving it back. "The number," he said. "It routes through a relay in Macau. Private line, registered to a shell. We tracked the relay in 11 minutes. Amara absorbed that. You already had people looking before I sent you the message." It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. "Yes." "Since this morning." "Since this morning." She let that sit for a moment. Since this morning meant since the flowers. Since the flowers meant before she'd even known there was something to track. He'd already been moving on this while she was reviewing property contracts and fielding phone calls and telling herself she wasn't bothered. "Who is Jay?" she said. Min-jae moved away from the window. He didn't sit either. He walked to the side of the desk, leaned against it with his arms crossed, which was not a casual posture despite appearing to be. She'd learned to read his body language the way you learn the layout of a room you live in, without thinking, without trying, just the accumulated knowledge of proximity. "Junho Park," he said. "He runs a legitimate shipping enterprise out of Incheon, on paper. And off paper. He moves things, connections, information, people occasionally. He's been operating in the peripheral space around several organizations for the better part of a decade, without being directly affiliated with any of them." A pause. "Including ours." "Is he a threat?" "He's been a theoretical threat for 2 years," Min-jae said. "He's become a specific one as of this morning." Amara was quiet for a moment. She was doing the thing she did when she was processing something that had multiple layers, holding still and letting it settle rather than reaching for it. "He sent flowers to my desk," she said slowly. "To me personally. He has my number. He knows my schedule." She looked at Min-jae. "How long has he been watching me?" The pause before his answer was a fraction too long. "We're still determining that." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." Min-jae. Her voice came out flat and direct, which was not always safe territory with him, but she was past the point of calibrating. "How long?" He held her gaze. "Possibly 8 weeks." The number landed differently than she expected. Not with fear exactly, with something colder. 8 weeks was not casual surveillance. 8 weeks was study. 8 weeks was someone building a map of her life with enough patience to care about accuracy. "He approached 2 of our junior associates 3 months ago," Min-jae continued, his voice even, the tone he used for briefings. "Both times under cover of legitimate business interest. Both times he collected information about internal staffing. Your name came up in one of those conversations." "Which associate?" A beat. "It doesn't matter." "It does matter, actually." "Amara? Someone on this floor gave my name to a man who then spent 8 weeks studying my schedule and my personal number and sent flowers to my desk," she said. "And you're telling me it doesn't matter who?" He didn't answer immediately. The look on his face was the particular look of a man who had made a decision he wasn't sure was the right one and was encountering its consequences. "Han," he said finally. Han Seung-woo, junior associate, mid-20s, perpetually nervous around her in a way she'd always chalked up to the general atmosphere of the building. She thought about all the mornings he'd been in and out of her office with documents, all the casual hallway exchanges, all the times he'd asked about her schedule under the guise of coordinating logistics. 8 weeks. "Where is Han now?" she said. "He's been dealt with." She absorbed that phrase the way you absorb a phrase whose meaning you understand and don't want to examine too closely. Dealt with. "He's no longer employed here." "That's all." Min-jae held her gaze steadily. "That's what I'm telling you." She chose not to push that particular thread. There were things about Min-jae's world she'd learned to understand without requiring specifics. The architecture of it, the way discipline moved through the organization, invisible and total, was something she'd made a kind of peace with. Not a comfortable peace, the kind you reach when you've decided the whole of something matters more to you than the parts you can't fix. What she hadn't made peace with was being kept at the edge of it. You knew something was wrong this morning, she said, before you came to my office. You already knew who he was before you saw the flowers. Min-jae said nothing. You came to my office, and you took them without saying anything to me, she said. You let me sit there all morning not knowing why. You sent Yoon with contracts. You let me do the whole morning as normal while you were already… She stopped, started again. You didn't tell me. I was still gathering information. You had a name by noon. I wanted confirmation before… You had a name by noon, she repeated, and you called me up here at 12:40 and asked me who sent the flowers like you didn't already know. The silence in the room changed quality. It went from tense to something else, something more exposed. Min-jae uncrossed his arms. I needed to know if you knew him. Amara stared at him. I needed to know, he said, if you'd had contact with him before this morning, before the flowers. She understood what he was saying. She understood it in the specific, careful way you understand something that hits you in a place you hadn't protected because you hadn't thought protection was necessary. You were checking, she said, if I was involved. I was eliminating the possibility of me being involved. He held her gaze without flinching. It's a standard protocol in this kind of… Min-jae. Her voice was quiet. Not wounded. She'd decided a long time ago that she didn't do wounded at work. Not visibly, not in this building. Just quiet. 3 years, 2 months. I have sat in that office below this one, and I have managed your world, and I have never, not once, given you a reason to think I would. I know that. Then why? Because someone is using you to reach me, he said, and I had to know how far it went before I could know how to respond. That's not a statement about your loyalty. It's operational. It felt like a statement about my loyalty. I understand that. Do you? Amara. He said her name differently than he said most things. She'd noticed it a long time ago, and she noticed it again now. The slight change in register, like the word meant more than names usually did. I know what you've given this organization. I know what you've given… He stopped. Recalibrated. I know your value. She waited to see if he was going to finish the original sentence. He wasn't. She could see the decision to redirect playing out across his face, and the way decisions played out on his face, quickly and with very little visible trace. Your value, she echoed, softly, not bitterly, just noting it. He looked away from her for the first time since she'd walked in. His eyes went to the window, to the gray city below. Junho Park is not interested in you, he said. He's interested in what you know, your access, your proximity to the organization's operations. A beat. Your proximity to me. He thinks I'm a way in. He's been, historically, in that kind of assessment. He identifies people who are close to leadership and he finds leverage. He paused. He sent flowers because he wanted you to feel seen, noticed, because he's done his research and he understands that you're… He stopped. That I'm what? She said. He turned back from the window. His expression had gone to the underwater place again, and this time it stayed there longer than usual, and Amara watched him decide something while standing very still and not helping him do it. That you're someone who would respond to being noticed, he said. He's trying to make you feel valued, so that when he asks you for something, you'll feel like you owe him. The words were delivered as analysis, tactical, impersonal, but they landed somewhere personal anyway, because they were an accurate description of a specific vulnerability, and the fact that Min-jae had that description available, that he knew it, had identified it as a target, meant he'd spent time understanding her in a way she'd never thought to question. She thought about all the times she'd made herself smaller in this building, all the times she'd apologized for mistakes that weren't serious enough to require apology, laughed off condescension from Director Lim and the other executives, shown up every morning and done twice the work of anyone on her level and asked for nothing beyond the salary and the job. She thought about the card. For the woman who makes ordinary days worth remembering, how easy it had been to smile. So he's right, she said, about the vulnerability. He identified a human response, not a weakness. There's a difference. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. She picked up her notepad from his desk. He let her take it. She turned to a clean page, wrote the name, Junho Park, Incheon Shipping, and the date. The deliberate motion of it helped her. She'd always been like this, Writing things down as a way of establishing ground beneath her feet. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Nothing yet. I need you to continue operating normally." Normal. Yes. While a man I've never met who has been watching me for 8 weeks sends me messages and may send other things. Yes. She looked at him. "And if he contacts me again?" "You forward it immediately and you do not respond." "Do not respond," she repeated, "under any circumstances." "And you won't tell me what you're planning?" He looked at her steadily. "Not yet." "Because it's operational." "Yes." She nodded once, closed the notepad. "All right." She turned toward the door. "Amara." She stopped but didn't turn around. She was tired. Not the physical kind, but the kind that settles in the chest after a conversation that's required you to hold too many things at once. "I didn't question your loyalty," he said. Behind her, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath the steadiness that hadn't been there earlier. "I questioned the situation. There's a difference." She considered that for a moment. "I know," she said, "but it didn't feel like a different thing when I was sitting in that office not knowing." She left without waiting for a response. The next 3 days were the most precise performance of her career. She arrived at the same time every morning. She filed the same reports. She attended the same coordination meetings and redirected the same phone calls and managed the same impossible scheduling conflicts with the same careful competence that had kept her employed for 3 years. She did all of it while being aware, in the back of her mind like a sound you can't quite locate, that somewhere below the surface of normal operations, something was moving. Min-jae said nothing further. He passed through her orbit daily, handing off files, issuing instructions, occasionally appearing in her doorway for reasons that were always officially justified. And he looked at her in the particular way he'd been looking at her since Tuesday morning, like she was something he was keeping careful track of without wanting to be obvious about keeping careful track. She pretended not to notice. She was very good at pretending not to notice. On Thursday, a delivery arrived at the front desk. Not flowers this time. A small package wrapped in plain paper, addressed to her by name in the same clean handwriting. The receptionist brought it to her personally, rather than sending it through the usual internal mail, which meant the receptionist had already been told to do exactly that, which meant Min-jae's instruction had reached the front desk before the package did. She set it on her desk and looked at it. Her phone buzzed immediately. Min-jae's private line. "Don't open it. I'm sending someone." She put the phone face down. She sat and looked at the package for 4 minutes. It was roughly the size of a book. It didn't tick. It didn't smell like anything. It was just a package sitting on her desk that someone had wrapped with attention. The corners were neat, the paper was good quality, the tape had been applied in precise lines. She thought about a man she'd never seen. Careful handwriting, patient enough to watch someone for 8 weeks. Patient enough to send 2 separate things, 3 days apart, each one designed to communicate something slightly different. The first had said, "I see you." The second, she didn't know yet, but she knew the escalation was intentional. 2 of Min-jae's men arrived in under 6 minutes. She recognized one of them, Park Chul, early 40s, former military bearing that he'd never quite shed. He looked at the package and then looked at her with an expression of professional neutrality. "We'll take it to security," he said. "What will happen to it?" "It'll be checked, and then Mr. Kang will decide whether I'm allowed to know what's inside it." Park Chul's professional neutrality did not waver. "Those are the current instructions." She stood up because sitting while they took things from her desk felt worse than standing. "All right." They took the package. They left. She stood at her desk for a moment in the particular silence of having something removed, and then she sat back down and opened her laptop and pulled up the afternoon schedule, because that was what she did. At 4:17, Min-jae appeared in her doorway. He had the package. It was open now, the careful wrapping gone, replaced by a security team's efficient deconstruction. Inside was a book. She could see the cover from across the room, a collection of Korean classical poetry translated into English. Min-jae set it on her desk. "It's clean," he said. "No devices, no chemical treatment. Oh." She looked at the book, then at him. "There was a card," he said. He held it out. Small ivory envelope, opened already. She took the card out. "A woman who makes ordinary days worth remembering deserves something that lasts longer than flowers." She read it twice. Set it down. He's escalating the message, she said. Yes. He wants me to feel like he understands me. Yes. The flowers were a first impression. This is a second impression. He's building something. Min-jae studied her for a moment. Yes. She turned the book over in her hands. It was a good book. Not a performative gift chosen for price, but a chosen thing, something that suggested research. Someone had looked at what she read, what she cared about, and selected accordingly. The violation of that this careful attention came from someone with intentions she couldn't fully see, sat in her chest like something she couldn't swallow down. I want to respond, she said. The room changed temperature. I know it's not sanctioned, she said. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I want. She looked at him directly. I want to respond to him. I want to communicate with him. Not to give him anything, not information, not access. I want to understand who I'm dealing with, what he wants specifically, how he thinks. Min-jae's expression had gone very still. You're not trained for that kind of engagement. I've been watching how you handle people for 3 years, she said. I know how to listen for what someone's not saying. Listening in this building is different from, he chose me, she said. Not someone from your security team, not someone who looks like what he'd expect to encounter. He chose the secretary who drops things and apologizes too much. Her voice stayed level. He thinks I'm easy. He thinks I'm grateful for attention and too naive to question where it comes from. And that gives me something your security team doesn't have. Min-jae was quiet for a long moment. You want to use what he thinks about you, he said. I want to use what he got wrong about me, she said. That's different. He looked at her for a long moment. The underwater look was back, but there was something else in it now. Something that wasn't calculation, wasn't strategy, was something she'd seen in glimpses over 3 years and never let herself look at directly. He was afraid. Not for the organization. She understood that in a sudden, certain way that rearranged several things she thought she'd already understood. He was afraid for her. The flowers, the investigation, the 47 seconds. It wasn't protocol. None of this had ever been protocol. She opened her mouth. He spoke first. I'll consider it, he said. Flat, controlled. The voice he used when he'd already decided something and wasn't ready to say so. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then her phone rang. The external line, the logistics partner in Busan who always called late. And she reached for it, and Min-jae picked up the book from her desk, and for a moment they were both holding it, his hand over hers on the cover, and neither of them moved. The phone rang a 3rd time. She answered it. He let go of the book and walked out. She spent the next 22 minutes discussing cargo schedules with a man in Busan who talked too fast, and she did it with complete competence and full attention, and underneath all of it, in the carefully folded place she kept small and out of the way, something had come partially unfolded. She was done waiting to be told what was happening. She was done being managed. That evening, she worked late. Not unusual. She often stayed past 7 when the week was complicated. But tonight she stayed past 8 and then past 9. And she was still at her desk at 9:30 when the cleaning staff came through the floor with quiet efficiency and the overhead lights shifted to the overnight setting, cooler and more clinical. She wasn't finishing work. She was thinking. She was thinking about 8 weeks of surveillance. She was thinking about a man named Jun-ho Park, who moved information and connections through a city where everyone was connected to everyone else through layers she could only partially see. She was thinking about the way he'd escalated. Flowers, then a book. And what the 3rd move would be. Because there would be a 3rd move. Men like that didn't send 2 gifts without having a 3rd one ready. She was also thinking about Min-jae's hand on the book, his hand over hers. She was thinking about how he'd said, I know your value, and stopped before finishing what he'd actually started to say. She put both thoughts in their respective places and looked at the screen in front of her. She'd been doing research of her own. Quiet, careful research, using the access she had to the organization's legitimate business records. Jun-ho Park's shipping enterprise intersected with 3 of Baekryong's legitimate subsidiaries, not directly, but through logistics chains. She'd been following those chains for the past 2 hours, tracing the connections the way you trace a watermark on paper by holding it up to light. He hadn't approached Baekryong from outside. He'd been working the edges from inside the legitimate business network for longer than 8 weeks. longer than 3 months. The junior associate's conversation was a data point, not the beginning. She printed what she'd found on the secure printer, 4 pages. She paper-clipped them neatly and wrote a note on a Post-it. Look at the subsidiary intersections. The approach didn't start with Han. And she put them in an envelope and left it on Min-jae's desk. She was walking back through the executive floor toward the elevator when she passed the small conference room and heard voices. She wasn't trying to hear, she just passed and the door was slightly ajar, and she heard Min-jae's voice, and then a voice she didn't recognize, and one word clearly through the gap. Her name. She stopped. The second voice said something she couldn't fully catch. Then Min-jae's voice, sharp and very controlled. She's not part of the operation. The second voice again. She caught fragments, already too visible. If Park escalates to direct contact. Min-jae, I said she's not part of it. She's already in it, whether you... I know that. Quiet. The quiet that was louder than raised voices. Which is why I'm handling it. Silence. Then, the dinner invitation went out tonight. He'll approach her directly within 48 hours. Amara stood very still in the hallway. A dinner invitation. Direct contact within 48 hours. Min-jae knew. He'd known before she was even out of the building tonight. He'd had this information while she was still at her desk doing research, while she was leaving that envelope on his desk. And he hadn't come to tell her. The conference room was silent now. She heard the sound of something being set down on the table. She heard Min-jae exhale. One controlled breath, the kind that meant he was pulling something back in. Then she heard him say very quietly to whoever was in that room, "No one goes near her without my direct authorization. No one moves without me." She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She watched the numbers change above the doors. The dinner invitation had already gone out. Within 48 hours, she'd be approached directly. And Min-jae had already decided what was going to happen. She could hear it in the way he'd said, "I'm handling it," in the weight of that word handling, which meant she was still something being managed, still something being moved around a board by someone who hadn't thought to ask her what she wanted to do with her own life. The elevator opened. She stepped in. She thought about what she'd said to him this afternoon. He chose the secretary who drops things and apologizes too much. He thinks I'm easy. She thought about how she'd spent 3 years being the most competent person in a building full of people who never quite saw it, being indispensable and invisible at the same time. The woman who made the whole thing run while others made decisions. The elevator descended. She watched the floor numbers drop. By the time the doors opened in the lobby and she stepped out into the cool night air of the city, Amara Brooks had made a decision. She was going to respond to Junho Park, not because Min-jae authorized it, not because the operation required it, because she was done being the piece on the board that everyone moved without asking, and because somewhere in the past 48 hours, she'd understood that if she didn't choose her own role in this, someone else would choose it for her. And she was finished with that. She walked out into the Seoul night with the city spread around her, indifferent and alive, and she took out her phone and she looked at the message still sitting in her recent texts. "I hope the flowers arrived safely." She put the phone away without responding. Not yet, but soon. And when she did, it would be on her terms, entirely, completely, without apology. The city moved around her. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, the lights reflecting in long, broken lines across the pavement. She started walking toward the subway. Behind her, 9 floors up, a light was still on in the executive suite. She didn't look back. The message came at 7:14 the next morning, before she'd even reached the building. She was on the subway, standing in the second car from the front because that's where she always stood, one hand on the overhead bar, the other holding her phone against her bag. The city was doing its morning thing outside the windows, blurring past in gray and yellow, and the occasional smear of neon still lit from the night before. Around her, people read their phones and stared at nothing and swayed with the motion of the train, all of them sealed inside their separate mornings. Her screen lit up. Unknown number. Different from the first one. She checked. She'd memorized the original. But the same country prefix structure. The same relay signature that meant nothing casual. A new line. He'd switched lines. "My assistant made a reservation at Cheongdam House for Saturday evening. Table for 2, 7 o'clock. I would very much like it if you came." She read it 3 times on the moving train. Around her, no one looked up. She put her phone in her bag and kept her hand on the overhead bar and stared at the window where the tunnel wall was moving fast and close, and she breathed once, deliberately, all the way down. 48 hours. That's what the voice in the conference room had said. He'd been off by about 38 hours. She did not forward the message to Min-jae immediately. She held it for 4 subway stops, which was long enough to be a choice and short enough to still be defensible. And she used those 4 stops to think clearly, because she'd learned long ago that the gap between receiving information and acting on it was where most people made their worst decisions. Junho Park had just escalated from indirect to direct. The gifts had been the opening, setting a tone, establishing presence, making her feel the weight of being seen. The dinner invitation was the move. This was him saying, "I'm ready to meet you. I'm confident enough to ask," which meant he thought she was ready. Which meant 8 weeks of watching her had given him the impression that she was, by now, curious enough and flattered enough and perhaps lonely enough to say yes to a man who'd sent beautiful things and chosen them carefully. She thought about how accurate that assessment almost was. Then she thought about Min-jae's voice saying, "I'm handling it to someone in a conference room," while she was 9 floors below, not knowing. She got off at her stop and walked the 6 minutes to the building and forwarded the message to Min-jae's private line at 7:29, just before she reached the lobby doors. His reply came while she was in the elevator. "Come straight up." She didn't. She went to her office first, made coffee. She knocked the spoon off the counter and picked it up without flinching, which was such a normal, small thing that it almost made her laugh. Except that this morning, nothing quite made it to a laugh. She sat down, opened her schedule, read through the morning's calendar with actual attention, the way she always did, because the work was real regardless of everything else happening around it. She went up at 8:15, on her own schedule. What? I was behind his desk when she walked in, which was unusual. He rarely sat behind the desk in early meetings, preferring to stand or to use the conference table along the side wall. The desk was a formality, a piece of theater, and he generally reserved it for people he needed to remind of specific power dynamics. She noticed and said nothing about it. He'd read the message clearly. His laptop was open, 2 phones on the desk, and Park Chul was standing near the door behind her in a posture that meant the door was not going to open again until Min-jae decided it should. "Saturday," Min-jae said. "Yes. Cheongdam House, 7 o'clock. "That's what it says." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was itself unusual, because in 3 years she'd learned most of his expressions the way you learn a language through total immersion. This one had too many layers moving underneath it simultaneously. "You waited 30 minutes before forwarding it," he said. She held his gaze. "I was on the subway." "Your phone works on the subway." "I know." A silence. "You're going to tell me not to go," she said. "I'm telling you that I'm sending someone else. A trained, it won't work. Operative who can handle direct engagement with Min-jae." She said it quietly. "He spent 8 weeks watching me specifically. He knows how I walk and what time I arrive and probably how I take my coffee. If you send someone who isn't me, he'll know before she sits down. And then we lose the only advantage we have." "What advantage?" "That he thinks he knows exactly what I am," she said. "And he's wrong." Min-jae was quiet. The kind of quiet she'd learned meant he already knew the argument she was making was correct and was looking for the structural flaw in it. "You said that yesterday," he said, "about using what he got wrong. I meant it yesterday. I mean it today. Yesterday I said I'd consider it. Have you?" Another silence, heavier than the first. "Walk me through what you think happens," he said, "if you go." She'd thought about this on the walk from the subway. She'd been thinking about it since the night before, honestly. Since the decision she'd made walking out into the wet Seoul street, which felt both very far away and very close. "He invites me to dinner because he thinks I'm susceptible to being made to feel valuable," she said. "He'll be charming, attentive, smart about it. He won't ask for anything directly, not the first meeting. He'll build. He'll make me feel like the conversation is happening on my terms. Somewhere in there, he'll try to assess what I know, how I feel about the organization, whether there's any gap between my loyalty and my frustration." "And there is a gap," Min-jae said. Not unkindly, just factually. She didn't break eye contact. "There are things I find frustrating," she said. "That's different from a gap." He absorbed that without comment. If I go, she continued, I let him think he's building something. I ask the questions that seem curious but are actually calibrating. I listen for what he wants specifically. Not generally, but specifically. And I give your team enough to work with. You're describing something that requires training you don't have. I'm describing something that requires understanding people, she said, which I've been doing in this building for 3 years in conditions that were not exactly gentle. Something crossed his face then. Quick, gone before she could fully name it. If he realizes what you're doing, Min-jae said, the situation changes immediately. He has resources. He has people. I know. He's not a man who responds to being deceived by letting someone walk away cleanly. I know that too. Amara, I know the risk, she said. I'm asking you to let me take it. Not for the organization. Not because you need me to. She held his gaze and said the rest of it simply, without drama, because it was just true. Because I'm already in it. I've been in it since the flowers. And standing on the outside of the decision about my own life while you and Park Chul and whoever was in that conference room last night figure out what to do with me. That's not something I'm willing to keep doing. The room was very quiet. Park Chul behind her didn't move. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment with the expression she couldn't read. Then he looked away. At the window, at the city, at the nothing outside the glass that he seemed to find useful in moments when the room had too much in it. Friday, he said finally. If you still want to go on Saturday, we spend Friday doing preparation, full briefing, everything I know about Junho Park, every technique he's used in previous approaches, everything you need to know about how to handle the conversation. She didn't let herself react visibly. She just said, all right. My team will be inside the restaurant. You won't see them. I know. If anything changes, anything, you use the signal we'll establish Friday and you leave immediately. Yes. He turned back from the window. His eyes settled on her with a weight she'd been aware of more frequently over the past 72 hours, like something had shifted in the way he looked at her and hadn't shifted back. One more thing, he said. Okay. The envelope you left on my desk last night, he paused. The subsidiary intersections. Another pause. Longer. That was 4 years of connection buried in public filings. My financial team took 6 weeks to find half of what you found in... He stopped. How long did you spend on it? About 2 hours. He looked at her, said nothing. She picked up her notepad. I'll be at my desk. Send me whatever you need reviewed before the Incheon call. She left before he could say anything else, because some moments were better closed cleanly, and because she knew that if she stayed in that room looking at his face for another 60 seconds, she was going to become aware of too many things she wasn't ready to be aware of yet. Friday arrived the way difficult days arrive, too quickly and with too much clarity. She went up to the executive floor at 9, and they spent 4 hours in the side conference room, just the two of them, with the door closed and a whiteboard and 2 legal pads, and the kind of concentrated attention she'd only seen Min-jae apply to things that genuinely mattered to him. He told her everything he knew about Junho Park. 43 years old, born in Daegu, raised partly in Hong Kong, educated at a British university she recognized. Built his shipping enterprise in his early 30s through a combination of legitimate freight contracts and parallel information brokering, moving data and connectivity the way his ships moved physical cargo. He had no permanent criminal affiliation, which made him harder to categorize and harder to address through any official channel. What he had instead was a long, quiet history of finding the places where powerful people's organizations were porous and inserting himself carefully at those points. He had been married once, divorced, 1 child, a daughter, who lived in Hong Kong with the ex-wife. He attended the same 3 charity events every year, donated in amounts calibrated to be visible but not aggressive. He played tennis on Tuesday mornings. He read actual physical books. He's patient, Min-jae said. He was standing at the whiteboard, and he'd been writing names and arrows and dates for the past hour. His handwriting, she noticed distantly, was nothing like what was on the card. Clean but blocky. Nothing careful about it. Patient and methodical, she said. He doesn't improvise. Almost never. His approaches are pre-planned 2 to 3 moves deep. He already knows what he'll say at Saturday's dinner. He has contingencies for multiple responses from you. So I shouldn't give him the response he's planned for. Min-jae looked at her. What do you mean? He has contingencies for the obvious responses, she said. Suspicion, warmth, deflection, nervousness. He's mapped the responses he expects from the woman he's been watching. She tapped her pen on the legal pad. So I should be something he didn't map. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. What? Curious, she said. Not flattered, not suspicious. Genuinely curious about him. Ask him things. Not about business, about him. People who plan everything find genuine curiosity disorienting because they don't have a contingency for someone who just wants to understand them. Min-jae studied her. You've done that before. In this building, every week. She met his eyes. It's what I do. Something shifted in his face. She moved past it. They spent another hour on specific topics to avoid. Names, dates, financial structures that she shouldn't demonstrate knowledge of. They established a signal. If she touched the stem of her water glass, the team inside would be ready to move within 90 seconds. They went through the physical layout of Cheongdam House, which Min-jae had printed from the restaurant's booking system with the kind of access that she'd learned not to ask specifically about. By 1 o'clock, she understood Junho Park better than she'd understood most people she'd worked with for years. At 1:15, Min-jae poured water for her from the carafe on the conference table. Not asked, just done, and it was such an ordinary gesture that it landed strangely, like a reminder that beneath all the operational architecture, there was still just a person across the table. Are you afraid? He said. She considered the question seriously. Not the way I'd expected to be. What does that mean? It means I thought I'd be afraid of him, she said. Of the dinner, of what could go wrong. But the thing that actually makes me nervous is… She stopped, reorganized. I don't want to disappoint you. Min-jae was very still. That's a problem, she said, because I know that if I go into that dinner thinking about what you expect from me, I won't be listening to him the way I need to. So I have to… She paused. I have to put that down somewhere. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You won't disappoint me. You don't know that. I know it specifically, he said, and his voice was different enough from his usual register that she looked up. He was looking at her with that unreadable layered expression that had been appearing more frequently, and for the first time she didn't look away from it immediately. She let herself look at it for a full 3 seconds. Then she looked back at her notes, because Friday was not the day. Tomorrow, she said, 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, he confirmed. She gathered her legal pads. He held the door for her. She walked through without looking back. Saturday morning, she woke at 6 and lay in her apartment ceiling for 20 minutes doing exactly nothing. Her apartment was small and aggressively organized. Everything in it had a place because she'd needed early on to have one space in her life where things stayed where she put them. She'd spent Sunday painting the living room a deep rust orange that every person who visited commented on, and she'd never once regretted. There were books everywhere, properly shelved, and a coffee maker she'd spent too much money on, and a small window that looked out over a narrow street where a noodle shop opened at 7 and smelled like good things. She lay in bed and looked at her ceiling and thought, I'm going to dinner tonight with a man who has been watching me for 8 weeks, and who wants to use me to damage the most dangerous organization in the city. Then she got up and made coffee and took a shower and spent 40 minutes deciding what to wear, which was not something she did often. She was a person of practical decisions regarding clothes, but tonight the choice mattered in a specific way. She needed to look like Amara Brooks, not a different, sharper version, not someone performing confidence, just herself, but intentional about it. She chose a dress she'd bought 8 months ago and only worn once, deep green, structured at the shoulders, exactly her size without apology. She wore her hair natural, which she did 3 days a week, and which she'd spent years being vaguely self-conscious about in the Baekryong building before she'd quietly stopped being self-conscious about it. She wore the earrings her mother had sent for her birthday, gold, simple. She looked in the mirror. She looked like herself. That was the right answer. She arrived at Cheongdam House at 6:58. The restaurant was the kind of place where the lighting was so carefully designed, you immediately became aware of how much thought had gone into every detail. Not ostentatious, just relentlessly considered. The host greeted her by name, which she registered without reacting to. He was already here then, or had sent his name ahead. They led her to a corner table, private without being hidden. 2 glasses of water already poured, a small arrangement of white flowers in the center, and she absorbed that detail, the flowers, and understood what it was meant to signal and chose not to let it signal anything to her face. Junho Park stood when she approached. He was exactly what she'd expected and nothing like what she'd imagined. Medium height, well-proportioned, with the kind of face that suggested constant mild amusement at the world. He was dressed without ostentation, a good suit, a watch that was expensive but not aggressive about it. He had gray at his temples and eyes that were doing something she recognized immediately. He was reading her, quickly, carefully, assigning her to one of his prepared categories. She smiled before he could finish doing it. "Mr. Park," she said. "Ms. Brooks." His English was impeccable, British inflected. He gestured to the chair across from him. "I'm genuinely glad you came." "I was curious," she said, and she meant it and let him hear that she meant it, because the best way to deliver a truth you've decided to weaponize is to deliver it as a truth. They sat. He poured wine without asking if she wanted it, which she noted. She lifted the glass, did not drink immediately, turned it slightly on the tablecloth. "You know who I am," he said. "Not a question. I know your name," she said, "and that you have very good taste in flowers." He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced without being false. "I do research," he said. "I hope that doesn't feel invasive." "Research takes time," she said. "I'm curious what made me worth it." Something in his expression adjusted, just slightly. He'd prepared for deflection, for nervousness, possibly for calculated warmth. He hadn't specifically prepared for this, for someone who asked the question directly and looked comfortable with the answer either way. "You're the most important person in that building," he said. People often say things like that to secretaries. "I mean it specifically, not as a compliment." He held her gaze. "You know everything, you see everything, and everyone in that organization treats you like you're peripheral." She looked at him for a moment. "Including you." He paused. Then he laughed, surprised, genuine. "Fair," he said. "That's fair." She let the moment breathe. Then she asked him about his daughter in Hong Kong, which she wasn't supposed to know about, and watched his face carefully as he absorbed the fact that she'd done her own research. And then she let him lead the conversation for the next 40 minutes, because listening to him talk was the fastest way to understand how he thought. He was good. He was very good. He circled her gradually, asking questions that seemed personal but were calibrated. How long had she been in Seoul? Did she have family here? What had drawn her to the work she did? Establishing a picture of isolation, testing the edges. She answered honestly where it cost her nothing. She deflected where it cost her something, but deflected softly, redirecting rather than refusing, so the conversation kept moving and he kept feeling like it was going his way. 8:45, over dessert she wasn't eating, he leaned forward slightly. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "Please," she said. "Kang Min-jae's organization is going to face a very significant disruption in the next 6 months, he said. "Not from me. From outside forces that have been accumulating pressure for longer than most people realize. When that disruption comes, the people closest to him will be exposed in ways that are difficult to protect against." He paused. "I've seen it happen before. People who were completely loyal, completely committed, and still ended up holding consequences they didn't cause." She looked at him. "You're warning me." "I'm offering you a choice," he said, "before it becomes urgent." "What kind of a choice?" He smiled again. This one different from the first, more careful. "There are people who would very much like to understand certain operational details about how Baekryong functions," he said. "Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would put you in legal jeopardy. Scheduling patterns. Communication rhythms. The kind of thing you know without even thinking about it." He set his wine glass down. "In exchange, the people I work with can guarantee that when the disruption comes, you have somewhere safe to land." The table was quiet for a moment. She looked at him. Let herself look at him fully. At the careful, practiced architecture of his pitch. At the genuine intelligence behind it. At the place where it met the thing he actually was underneath the charm. "You think I'm unhappy there," she said. "I think you're undervalued there," he said, "which is different." "It is different," she agreed, "but it's not unhappy." He tilted his head. "I want to understand something," she said. "You sent flowers and a book, and you've just spent almost 2 hours making me feel like you see me clearly." She kept her voice even. "Do you actually think I can't see what you're doing?" The table went very quiet. He didn't move. His expression held. I think, he said carefully, that knowing what someone is doing and still choosing it aren't mutually exclusive. That's true, she said, but this isn't that. Something shifted behind his eyes. The first genuine recalibration she'd seen from him all evening. She reached for her water glass. She touched the stem. I want to tell you something honestly, she said, because I think you're a person who actually appreciates honesty when they encounter it. She looked at him steadily. I came tonight because I wanted to understand you, and I do now. You're very good at what you do. The research, the gifts, the conversation. All of it was exactly right. You found the gaps correctly. She paused. You just got the ending wrong. Junho Park looked at her. For the first time that evening, he didn't look like a man who had prepared for this. Ms. Brooks, my name is Amara, she said quietly, and I am going to need you to stop sending things to my desk. She picked up her bag. The restaurant doors opened. She didn't look at who came through because she didn't need to. She heard it, the change in ambient sound, the specific quality of stillness that happened when Min-jae's men entered a space and the space understood them. She stood. Junho Park looked past her at the door, and his face underwent the slow, terrible process of a man understanding that he had miscalculated something fundamental. His jaw was still. His shoulders didn't move, but his eyes did something she would remember afterward. They flickered, just once, with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, and was exactly what a very controlled man looks like when he realizes the ground under his plan was never there. She looked at him one last time. You said I was the most important person in that building, she said. You were right. You just didn't understand what that meant. She walked away from the table. She walked toward the door and she didn't look back, which took more than she expected because her heart was hitting the inside of her chest with serious intent, and her hands were doing the thing where they wanted to shake, but she wasn't letting them. And the 30 feet between the table and the door was the longest distance she'd walked in a long time. She pushed through into the cool night air and stopped on the pavement outside and breathed. One breath, then another. Then her phone buzzed. Not Min-jae's line, not the relay number Junho had used before. A third number. Different prefix structure entirely. She looked at the screen. You performed beautifully tonight, Ms. Brooks. The question is, does Kang Min-jae know what I know about his father's death? Because I do. And the person who told me was inside that restaurant tonight. Not at my table. At his. She stood on the pavement outside Cheongdam House and read the message twice. Her hands went still. All of them did. Everything in her went suddenly, completely still, the way the world goes still in the half-second between something happening and the body catching up. Someone inside the restaurant. Not at Junho's table. At Min-jae's, the team he'd sent to protect her. One of his own people. She looked up. Through the restaurant window, she could see the table she'd just left. She could see Junho Park still sitting, his wine glass in his hand, looking not at her but at something across the room. His face was not the face of a man who had lost. It was the face of a man who had revealed a smaller loss to obscure the existence of the larger game. He'd known the dinner would fail. He'd come to the dinner knowing it would fail, because the dinner was never the operation. It was the misdirection. She looked at the message again. His father's death. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know the shape of that sentence or what was inside it. But she knew, with the cold certainty of someone who had just understood that the board was larger than they'd been shown, that whatever it meant, Junho Park had been holding it for longer than 8 weeks, and that the flowers and the book and the dinner and all of it had been designed not to get information from her but to get Min-jae's attention focused in one direction, while something else moved in another. She dialed Min-jae's number. It rang once. I'm outside, he said. She could hear the ambient noise of the restaurant behind his voice. He was still inside. Get out, she said. Her voice came out steady, and she was grateful for that. Get out of the building right now and bring whoever is with you. A pause. Amara, there's a message on my phone, she said. There's someone on your team, Min-jae. There has been this whole time. Junho Park knew tonight was going to fail. This was never about me. The silence on the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then she heard him move. He came through the restaurant doors 40 seconds after she called him. She counted. She was standing on the pavement with her phone in her hand and the night air cold against her arms, And she counted because counting was something her hands could do while the rest of her was holding very still, and he came through in 40 seconds with Park Chul directly behind him and two others she recognized from the building's security rotation flanking the exit. He looked at her first, before anything else, before scanning the street, before checking positions. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there confirmed something, because his jaw set immediately and his eyes went to the phone in her hand. "Show me," he said. She held out the screen. He read it. She watched him read it. The slight stillness that moved through him. The way his breathing didn't change, but everything else did. The way a man absorbs a specific kind of information when it lands in a place that was already raw. His father's death. She didn't know what that meant yet. She knew from his face that it meant something real. Park Chul read it over his shoulder and said something in Korean, low and fast. Min-jae didn't answer him. He was still looking at the screen. "Who else got this message?" he said. "Just me. Different number from the ones before." "Third line." "Yes." He handed her phone back. His hand was steady. His face was the specific blankness she'd come to understand as the outermost layer of something that was not blank at all. The controlled surface he deployed when something had gotten through his defenses, and he was deciding how much of that to let be visible. He turned to Park Chul and said 3 words in Korean. Park Chul moved immediately. Phone out, already dialing, already walking toward the car idling at the corner. The other 2 men flanked positions along the pavement without being told. Min-jae turned back to her. "Did Junho say anything before you left the table?" he said. Anything that felt like a delay, like he was buying time. She thought back. The specific quality of those last 30 seconds at the table. Junho's face when she'd said the ending was wrong, the way he'd looked past her at the door. He knew the men were coming, she said. He wasn't surprised. He was... She stopped. Reconstructed. He was watching the room, not panicking, watching. He was marking positions, Min-jae said, identifying my people inside. She understood what that meant. He has someone in there who can pass information about your team's locations. Or he had someone in there collecting it before the dinner started. The car at the corner was a black sedan she recognized. Not the official company vehicle, but one of the 3 rotation cars that Min-jae's team used when they didn't want to be official about it. Park Chul was in the passenger seat already. The engine was running. Min-jae's hand closed around her arm. Not gripping, just directing. And he moved her toward the car with the specific efficiency of someone who had done this before, and understood that speed and calm were not opposites. She got in. He got in behind her. The car was moving before the door fully closed. "The team inside," she said. "Lee is pulling them out now." "How many?" 4. "And the one who—" "I don't know yet." His voice was completely even. The evenness of someone controlling something with significant force. "I don't know which one." She sat with that for a moment. The city moved past the windows. The Cheongdam district giving way to wider streets, the lights changing quality as they moved away from the restaurant district. She looked at her phone again. Read the message a 3rd time. "Does Kang Min-jae know what I know about his father's death?" "Min-jae," she said quietly. He didn't look at her. He was looking at his own phone, messages coming in rapidly, his thumb moving fast. "Min-jae." He looked up. "What happened to your father?" she said. The car was quiet except for the engine and the city sounds outside and the low frequency of Park Chul's voice in the front seat relaying something she couldn't fully track. Min-jae held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back at his phone. "Later," he said. She recognized the word for what it was. Not deflection, not refusal. A promise. From a man who didn't make promises easily, later was load-bearing. She put her own phone away and looked at the city through the window and let it sit. They went to a location she'd never been to. Not the main building, not any of the satellite offices she'd coordinated logistics for. A 4-story building in Mapo that had a legitimate commercial laundry operation on the ground floor and absolutely nothing visible above it from the street. The car went around the back and through a gate that opened before they reached it and closed before she'd fully processed having passed through it. Inside, underground level, was a room that was clearly meant for exactly this kind of evening. Rectangular, harshly lit, with a central table and a wall of screens currently showing 8 different camera feeds that she didn't immediately recognize. 4 men were already there. More came in behind them. She counted 9 people total in the room, including herself, and she was the only one who looked like she'd been planning on going home after dinner. Min-jae went to the screens immediately. Park Chul pulled up something on a tablet and set it on the table. The room reorganized itself around Min-jae the way rooms with his people always did, everybody orienting slightly toward him without anyone directing it. The unconscious gravity of someone everyone in the space had decided to follow. She stood near the door and let the room settle. Then a man she didn't recognize came through a side door and Min-jae stopped moving. He was perhaps 50, with the build of someone who'd been large once and had compressed rather than diminished with age. He wore no jacket. He looked at Min-jae with the specific expression of someone who had been summoned and was not entirely certain the summons was appropriate. He looked at Amara. Something passed over his face. "This is the secretary," he said, in English, for her benefit or not. She couldn't tell. "Her name is Amara Brooks," Min-jae said. "She stays." The man looked at Min-jae for a moment. "This isn't... She stays," Min-jae said. Quieter. The quieter he got in a room, the more the room listened. The man, she didn't have a name for him yet, would get one later, sat down on the far side of the table without further argument, which told her something about who he was relative to Min-jae. Not subordinate, not quite equal, something lateral and complicated. "The message was sent from a routed line," Park Chul said, setting the tablet in the center of the table. "Third relay. It bounced through 4 servers, but we caught the originating signature. It matches a line registered to a communications firm in Gangnam." He looked at Min-jae. "That firm handles contracts for 3 of our subsidiary operations." The room went a specific kind of quiet. "So it's internal," someone said from the back. Younger voice. She didn't look to see who. "Or it's someone using internal access," Min-jae said. "Those aren't the same thing." He turned to the screens. He was looking at the camera feeds, cycling through them with a remote, pausing on 2, zooming slightly on a 3rd. She couldn't identify what she was seeing from where she stood. Then he stopped on one feed and stared at it. "Pull the full team list from tonight," he said. "Everyone who had a position inside Cheongdam House." A man at the table keyboard typed for 11 seconds. The screen on the left shifted to a list. She read it from where she stood, 7 names. She recognized 4 of them from the building. Min-jae read the list. He didn't move for a moment. Then he said one name. Kim Tae-young. Park Chul looked up from the tablet. "Pull his phone records from the last 48 hours, Min-jae said. "Not the work phone. The personal line he uses on Thursday nights when he thinks he's off rotation." 3 people in the room exchanged a look that she caught, and that told her they knew about the Thursday phone. They'd known about it and hadn't elevated it, which meant it had been categorized as a personal life detail and therefore irrelevant, which meant the gap in judgment was not Kim Tae-young's alone. 40 seconds of searching. Then, third outgoing call Thursday was to a number that routes through the same communications firm. The room was extremely still. Min-jae didn't react visibly. He just nodded once, very small, the way he nodded when something confirmed what he'd already concluded. She'd seen that nod before. She knew what came after it. "Where is he now?" Min-jae said. "He should be at the Cheongdam exit point," someone said. "Waiting for pickup after the..." "Call him in," Min-jae said. "Now. Tell him there's been a change. Don't tell him what." He turned from the screens and looked at the lateral, complicated man across the table. "And you can start explaining how Junho Park knows what he knows about my father." The room dropped another degree. The man across the table, she had his name now, someone had said it quietly when she wasn't looking. Director O, which was almost certainly not his actual title, looked at Min-jae with an expression she recognized as the expression of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has arrived at the moment of putting it down, and isn't sure whether it will be a relief or a detonation. "Sit down," O said. "I'll stand," Min-jae said. Min-jae. The name in his mouth had a different weight than it had in the room generally, like he had a specific right to it that others in the room did not. Min-jae pulled out the chair across from him and sat. O looked at Amara. "She stays," Min-jae said, without looking at her. O folded his hands on the table. He had the hands of someone who had done physical work for much of his life, and then stopped, thickened at the knuckles, deliberate in their stillness. "Junho Park's father," O said. Did business with your father 22 years ago, before Baekryong existed in the form it exists now, before you were involved in any of it. He paused. Your father made a decision during that period that affected Park's father significantly. The business relationship ended. Park's father spent the next 6 years attempting to recover what he'd lost and died before he managed it. He paused again. Junho Park was 21 when his father died. Min-jae said nothing. He's been building toward Baekryong for 12 years, Oh said. Not 8 weeks, not 3 months. 12 years. Everything he's done, the shipping operation, the information brokering, the approach through your subsidiaries, all of it has been preparation. He looked at Min-jae steadily. He doesn't want your business information. He wants the organization to collapse. He wants you specifically to be the one holding it when it does. The room was silent enough that she could hear the ventilation system. And my father's death, Min-jae said. His voice was a flat, careful thing. Oh held his gaze. Your father didn't die of a cardiac event. The sentence landed. Amara felt it land. She felt the specific stillness that moved through the room like a pressure wave. She watched Min-jae's face and she saw, just for a moment, just underneath the controlled surface, something that was not composure. Something that had been living underneath composure for a long time, and had just been pressed hard enough from below to be briefly visible. Say the rest of it, Min-jae said. We believe the cardiac event was induced, Oh said. We believe Park's network had access to medical personnel connected to your father's private physician. We believe the connection was cultivated over approximately 3 years. He paused. We believed this for 11 months. I didn't bring it to you because we didn't have enough to act on, and because... He stopped. His jaw moved. Because I made a decision about what you needed to know, and when. Min-jae was very still. She had seen Min-jae angry before. She'd seen the cold anger, the operational anger that became decisions rather than expressions. She had never seen this version, whatever was happening right now underneath the stillness. It was not like those other kinds. It was something older and more fundamental, and the stillness containing it was doing serious work. 11 months, Min-jae said. Yes. You've known for 11 months. We suspected for 11 months. We confirmed. You confirmed and then you decided, Min-jae said. What I needed to know. Oh didn't answer. Get out, Min-jae said. Min-jae, get out of this room. Still quiet. Still completely controlled. The controlled thing was somehow worse than raised would have been. You'll stay in the building. You won't make calls. Park Chul. Park Chul moved to Oh's side without being asked further. Oh stood slowly. He looked at Min-jae for a moment with an expression she thought might be something close to guilt. But she'd learned in this building that guilt and its adjacent emotions wore similar faces and were not always the same thing. He left. Park Chul came back 30 seconds later. Min-jae hadn't moved. He was sitting in the same position, both hands flat on the table, staring at the space where Oh had been. She crossed the room and sat down across from him. The chair Oh had been in. He looked at her. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything appropriate to say, and she understood that. She just sat there and looked at him and let the room be what it was, full of other people who were carefully not looking at either of them, working their tablets and their phones and their screens with intense professional attention. After a moment, he picked up his phone. Kim Tae-young, he said to Park Chul. Where is he? Incoming. ETA 7 minutes. Put him in the room on 3. Yes. He stood up, looked at Amara. Stay here. No, she said. He stopped. I'm not staying here, she said. I'm the reason tonight happened. I went to that dinner. I sent you that message. If Kim Tae-young gave information about me to Junho Park's network, my schedule, my number, my access, I want to be in that room. His expression went through 3 things quickly. Amara, you said she stays, she said, to O. When he looked at me. You said it twice tonight. She held his gaze. So let me stay. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the door. She followed. The room on the 3rd floor was smaller than the one below. Deliberately smaller, she understood. A table, 3 chairs, a light overhead that was not harsh but was positioned without warmth. A room designed to remove comfortable ambiguity. Kim Tae-young arrived 4 minutes later. She'd seen him before. Background figure in the Cheongdam operation, mid-30s, compact build, the kind of face that defaulted to agreeable. He came through the door with the specific energy of someone who had been called in unexpectedly and was working to appear unconcerned about it, which was itself a tell. He saw Min-jae. His face organized itself into the correct professional expression. Then he saw Amara. Something happened in his eyes. Small. Fast. Gone. She marked it. He sat when he was gestured toward the chair. Min-jae remained standing. Amara sat near the door, not at the table, slightly back, in the position of someone who might be an observer. She wanted him to discount her presence. She wanted to be background. Min-jae said his name, just his name. Kim Tae-young said, "Sir?" "Thursday night," Min-jae said, 7:40 p.m. "Who did you call?" The pause lasted 2 seconds too long. "My brother," Kim said. "He's been—" "The number doesn't go to your brother," Min-jae said. "We both know that. So let's not use time on it." Kim's face didn't collapse. She gave him that. He was controlled enough not to collapse. He looked at Min-jae and made a decision that she watched him make, and then he said, "I want to speak with a lawyer." "This isn't that kind of conversation," Min-jae said. "I understand what kind of conversation this is," Kim said. His voice had gone flat, resigned in a specific way, not afraid, exactly. The resignation of someone who has been expecting this room for a while and has made their private peace with it. "And I'm not going to tell you what you want to know." Silence. "Did you give him her number?" Min-jae said. Kim looked at Amara then, directly, for the first time since he'd entered. She looked back. "She's not part of this," Kim said. "She's sitting in this room," Min-jae said. "She became part of it when you pointed him at her." "I didn't—" Kim stopped. Started again. His jaw was tight. "I gave general information about organizational staffing. I didn't specifically—" "Her name came out of a conversation you were in," Min-jae said. "Her schedule. Her personal contact. Whether or not you handed it directly, you put it in a space where it could be collected." He paused. "How long?" Kim said nothing. "How long have you been in contact with Park's network?" "Nothing." "Kim." 14 months, Kim said. The number landed. 14 months. 3 months longer than O had been sitting on the information about Min-jae's father. The timeline stacked up in a particular way when you put those two numbers next to each other. "He told you something," Amara said. Both of them looked at her. She kept her voice even. She was watching Kim's face with the full attention she'd been deploying all evening, and she could see the thing in him that was neither loyalty to Junho Park nor hatred of Min-jae. It was something more ordinary and therefore more dangerous. It was a man who had been told a version of a story and believed it. "He told you something about the organization," she said. "Something that made you feel like you were on the wrong side." Kim's eyes stayed on her. "What did he tell you?" she said. "Amara." Min-jae's voice had a warning in it. She didn't break eye contact with Kim. "He spent 12 years building toward this. He's patient, and he's specific. He didn't recruit you with money. You're not a man who'd take money. Anyone who's worked with you for 6 months would know that." She paused. "He told you something that made you feel like choosing him was actually choosing right." Kim Tae-young looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "He told me what happened to Chairman Kang." The room absorbed that. "He told you," she said carefully, "that Min-jae's father was killed." "He told me who ordered it," Kim said. She went cold. She made herself hold very still and not look at Min-jae, because this was the moment. She could feel it in the room, in the specific charge that had gathered since O had said cardiac event, and then said the rest. This was the piece that Junho Park had built everything around. Not the flowers, not the dinner. This. Who, she said. Kim looked at Min-jae. "You already know," he said. "That's why O has been managing what you know for 11 months, because the person who gave the order is still—" The door opened. Park Chul stepped in and said 2 words in Korean. Min-jae moved before she could fully process what the words were. He was through the door in 3 steps, and she was on her feet immediately, and through the open door she heard it before she understood it. A sound from below, sharp and definitive, the sound of something breaking in a very specific way that wasn't accidental. She was in the hallway. Park Chul was ahead of her. Min-jae was already at the stairs. "Stay," Park Chul said to her, not unkindly. She followed anyway. The ground floor was chaos, in the specific sense that controlled professionals in crisis look like chaos from the outside, but are actually doing 12 coordinated things simultaneously. Two men she didn't know were near the back entrance. The laundry equipment that had been running background constant since they arrived had stopped, and in the silence of it, the sounds of the room were newly sharp. Min-jae was standing in the center of the ground floor looking at his phone. She reached him. "What?" "Junho Park left Cheongdam House 12 minutes after we did," he said. His voice was doing the absolutely controlled thing that meant the thing under it was significant. "He went to a secondary location in Yeouido." He looked at her. "He has O's daughter." She stared at him. "O has a daughter," she said. "I didn't know. She's 23. She doesn't know anything about any of this." His jaw was tight. "He took her from her apartment 20 minutes ago. We got the notification from the building's security camera." He looked at his phone. "He's sending terms." "Terms for what?" "For Kim Tae-young." He looked up. "He wants us to release Kim Tae-young with full immunity of transit, and he wants the documentation O has been sitting on about my father's case. All of it. And he wants 48 hours. In exchange for O's daughter." "Yes." She absorbed this. "What does he do with Kim Tae-young?" "Kim is the chain of evidence," Min-jae said. "He's the connection between Park's network and this organization. If Kim is free and the documentation is gone, everything Park has done for 12 years disappears. Clean slate." He paused. Park goes on. "Baekryong absorbs the damage. And whoever gave the order for my father walks away still protected. And if you don't..." He looked at her. She meant, "And if you don't give him what he wants, what happens to the girl?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "What does O say?" she said. "O isn't in a position to say anything useful right now. Can you find her before the 48 hours? We're working on it." Sharp. Not at her. At the situation. "We're working on it. The Yeouido location isn't confirmed, it's inferred from the camera direction," and he stopped, breathed. "We have people moving, but it's not confirmed." She looked at him. He looked like a man who was holding 4 different things, all of them important, all of them pulling different directions, and who had been doing this specific kind of holding for so long that he'd forgotten there was a version of standing that didn't require it. She thought about O saying, "I made a decision about what you needed to know." She thought about 11 months of managed information. She thought about Kim Tae-young in the room upstairs, the resignation of a man who had believed a version of a story specific enough to flip his loyalty. She thought about the message on her phone. "You performed beautifully tonight." The word beautifully. The way it landed at the time, like something being closed. Junho Park had known the dinner would fail. He'd sent the 3rd message during the dinner, timing it for when she was standing outside, just separated from Min-jae's people, alone on the pavement in a way he'd known she would be. He'd known the chain of information that would follow. He'd known Min-jae would pull everything back to a secondary location. He'd had someone watching O long enough to know O had a daughter and know where she lived. He hadn't been trying to get information out of Amara. He'd been trying to get Min-jae to move. "He needed you out of the main building tonight," she said. Min-jae looked at her. "Cheongdam House, the dinner, the message on my phone. It was all designed to get you to a secondary location with a reduced team, operating in emergency mode." She heard her own voice going faster, not from panic, but from the thing that happened in her brain when pieces locked. "He knew the message about your father would pull O into a conversation. He knew that conversation would create noise inside your organization at exactly the time he needed it to." She looked at Min-jae directly. "He took O's daughter from her apartment 20 minutes ago. That's how long it took to move after you left Cheongdam. He had people in position the whole time. He was watching to see when you relocated." Min-jae held her gaze. His expression was the face of a man hearing a thing he'd already arrived at and finding it worse for the confirmation. "He can't move on what he actually wants while your main building is operational," she said. "While your security structure is intact and centralized. He needed you here and reactive. He needed your attention fractured." She paused. "What's at the main building tonight?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time. "Skeleton crew," Park Chul said from behind her. She'd forgotten he was there. "Standard night rotation, 6 people." She looked at Min-jae. He was already on his phone. Get me eyes on the main building, he said, quiet and absolute. Now, all entrance cameras, parking structure, roof. He started moving toward the stairs. And get me a car. She followed him. Amara. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and turned. His face in the harsh ground floor light was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, the exhaustion of someone who had just understood the full geometry of what they'd been walked into. Stay here. I mean it this time. You're going to the main building. Yes. You're going with how many people? He didn't answer. How many, Min-jae? Enough. That's not a number. Park Chul and 4 others. 5 people, she said. To a building where someone who has been planning this for 12 years may or may not have people already inside, while half your security structure is here dealing with Kim Tae-young and the O situation. She looked at him steadily. Let me come. You're not... I know that building, she said. I know every floor, every access point, every security camera blind spot because I coordinated the camera upgrade 18 months ago, and I know exactly where the contractor cut corners. I know the night rotation staff by name. If someone is in that building who shouldn't be, I will see it in 30 seconds, in a way that it will take your security team 3 times as long to see. He looked at her. The underwater look, but pressured now. Pushed from beneath by urgency and time, and something else that had been building all evening and was still unresolved between them. You don't have a weapon, he said. I have a phone, and I know that building better than anyone in this room, she said. That's not nothing. His jaw moved. Min-jae. She said it quietly, the way she said it when it was just for him. Let me do something. Not because you need me to. Because I need to. The car at the back was running. Park Chul was already moving toward it. Min-jae looked at her for one more second. And in that second was everything. She understood that, every piece of the past 3 years and the past 72 hours, and everything that had been folded small and kept out of the way and was no longer staying put. And then he turned toward the car. Stay beside me, he said. Every second. You don't go through any door before me. She followed him into the night. The city was still doing its indifferent thing, moving, breathing, illuminated against the dark. And the car pulled out of the Mapo gate and accelerated into the late-night streets, and Amara sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and watched the buildings of Seoul move past the window and felt the specific clarity that comes when there is no longer anything left to manage or defer or fold carefully away. Whatever was waiting at the main building, she was going toward it. Not because Min-jae brought her, not because the operation required her, because she had been standing on the edges of this world for 3 years, essential and overlooked, and she was done with edges. She looked at the side of Min-jae's face in the car, the jaw set, the eyes moving across his phone, the slight tension in his shoulder that she knew was not just tactical, but the thing O's information had put there, the thing about his father that was now real in a way it hadn't been 2 hours ago. She wanted to say something. She didn't. There would be time. There would be a moment after this one, and in that moment she would say the thing she'd been not saying for 3 years. And it would be real in the way that only things said out loud can be real. But first this. The car turned onto the familiar approach to the Baekryong building, and Min-jae sat forward and Park Chul said something sharp, and the 2 men in the front exchanged a look, and she looked through the windshield at the tower in the distance, lit in its usual configuration against the Seoul night, and she saw what they saw in the same moment they saw it. 2nd floor. A light that should not be on at 11:40 on a Saturday night. She knew that floor. She knew the room. That was the server room where Baekryong's financial documentation, 12 years of it, including everything relevant to Chairman Kang's estate, including everything O had been protecting, was physically archived. The car stopped. Min-jae's hand closed around her wrist. Not directing, just there, contact, real and specific. Listen to me, he said. She looked at him. Whatever happens in the next hour, he said, you are the most important person in that building, not to the organization. He held her gaze with the directness of someone who has run out of time for anything but the direct thing. To me. Do you understand that? She felt the words land, felt them go somewhere they were going to stay. Yes, she said. He let go of her wrist. Then stay alive, he said, and he was out of the car and moving before she could answer. And she was out of the car 2 seconds behind him because that was the deal. That was what she'd said. Beside him every second. and the night air hit her and the building was ahead, and somewhere inside it someone was taking what didn't belong to them. She ran. The lobby was wrong the moment they entered it. She felt it before she could name it, the specific quality of a space that had been recently occupied and recently vacated. A disturbance in the air that wasn't visible but was present the way a sound is present after it ends, reverberating in the stillness. The security desk was staffed. One of the night rotation men, Jung-woo, who looked up when they came through and whose face did something she read immediately and filed. He was relieved to see them. Not surprised. Relieved. The face of someone who has been afraid and is now less afraid, which meant he'd had reason to be afraid in the last 30 minutes. Min-jae reached the desk in 4 steps. Status. 2 men came through 40 minutes ago, Jung-woo said. Credentials cleared through the system. They had level 2 access cards. He looked at Min-jae with the specific misery of a man delivering information he knows is going to land badly. I ran the check. The cards were legitimate. They were issued from inside, Park Chul said. Not a question. The system shows them issued 3 weeks ago. Standard contractor access. Which contractor? The HVAC maintenance firm. Jung-woo swallowed. I called the contact number for the firm 20 minutes ago when I noticed the second floor light. The number is disconnected. Min-jae was already moving toward the elevator bank. Park Chul peeled off toward the stairwell. 2 of the other men split left and right along the lobby perimeter. She stayed close to Min-jae the way she'd said she would. Not grabbing, not crowding, just close enough that the distance between them was always less than 3 feet. He stopped at the elevator and looked at her. Second floor, she said. The server room is in the interior southeast corner. There's a secondary access through the maintenance corridor behind the copy room. Most people don't know it exists. I found it when I was coordinating the renovation 2 years ago. She paused. If they're still in the building, that's how they'll try to leave. He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he turned to the remaining man, Young, name she didn't know, eyes doing the high alert thing, and said something in Korean. The man went toward the back corridor immediately. You've been in the maintenance corridor, Min-jae said to her. Once, by accident. Then I walked it deliberately because I don't like not knowing the shape of spaces I work in. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he hit the elevator button. When the doors open, he said, you stay back. I know. I mean it. I know, Min-jae. The elevator opened on the second floor to nothing visible and wrong-feeling air. The overhead lights were on standard setting. Nobody had switched to emergency, which meant either the 2 men didn't want to trigger building protocols or they'd already left. The hallway was empty. But at the far end, around the corner that led to the server room's anteroom, there was a sliver of light under a door that should have been dark. Min-jae moved along the hall wall. She moved behind him, keeping her breathing controlled, which was something she'd read about once and apparently retained because her body was doing it without instruction. Steady, not held, just measured. Her heart was doing the other thing, the counterpoint to the measured breathing, hitting her ribs with serious, repetitive force. The door to the server room anteroom was not fully closed. Someone had left it open 2 inches, careless, or maybe deliberate. She heard sounds through the gap, the mechanical hum of the server units, and underneath it, something else. The specific sound of physical material being moved. Files, drives, things being gathered. Min-jae reached back and put his hand flat against her sternum. Not rough, just definitive. Stay. She put her back against the wall. He pushed the door. 2 men. One at the server terminal against the far wall, the other near the filing cabinets along the right side. A bag open at his feet, already partly filled. Both of them turned when the door opened. The one at the terminal was young. Younger than she expected, 25 maybe, with the blank competence of someone trained to do this exact thing and no older than the training. The one at the files was older, 50s, with the look of someone who had been in rooms like this before. The older one moved first. It wasn't toward the door. It was toward something on the cabinet beside him. She saw it before Min-jae did, saw the hand going and understood what the hand was going toward, and she said his name, just Min-jae. But she said it with the specific weight of warning, and he moved. What happened next was fast and not clean, and nothing like the choreography of action in films she'd occasionally watched on late work nights. It was 2 people in a small room making rapid decisions with their bodies, while a third person pressed herself against the wall of the anteroom and watched through a 2-inch gap and breathed. The older man had a weapon. Min-jae reached him before he'd fully closed his hand around it, and the resulting collision sent both of them into the filing cabinet, hard enough that she heard it, felt it, almost, a crash of metal and weight. And the younger man at the terminal made a decision that was either brave or stupid and lunged for the door. She was in the doorway. She hadn't made a decision to step into the doorway. Her body had made the decision and informed her after the fact, the way the body does sometimes when it's operating ahead of the conscious mind. She was standing in the opening and he was coming at it, and there was a moment, half a second, maybe less, where she and this young man with the blank, competent face looked at each other across 3 feet of floor. He checked. The check cost him 2 seconds, which was the 2 seconds it took for Park Chul to come through the maintenance corridor door behind him with the specific momentum of a man who had been moving hard for 60 seconds and arrived exactly where he needed to be. After that, it was over. Not cleanly. There was noise, there was another collision, there was the sound of something hitting the floor that was heavy and final. But it was over. 30 seconds from the door opening, perhaps less. She was still in the doorway. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with something close to detachment, observing the shaking as a fact about her body without it particularly meaning anything about her. She pressed her right hand flat against the doorframe, and it stopped. Min-jae was standing over the older man, who was on the floor with Park Chul's knee on his back, breathing hard in the way of someone who'd taken a blow and was deciding what to do about it. Min-jae himself had a cut on his forearm. His sleeve was pushed up, and she could see it, not deep, but bleeding in the deliberate way that cuts bleed when the body is warm and moving. He hadn't seemed to notice it yet. The younger man was restrained against the far wall. The bag near the filing cabinet was still open. She could see what was in it from where she stood, physical drives, which told her they'd been after the archived files that weren't on the main network, the things O had been keeping separate and specific. And folders. Printed documentation, some of it in plastic sleeves. Min-jae turned and looked at her. She looked at his arm. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked down at his forearm like he was receiving news about a stranger. "It's fine." "It's not fine, it's bleeding." "Amara." "I'm aware of what just happened," she said steadily. "I'm still telling you you're bleeding." Something moved through his expression. He crossed the room toward her, stepped around the older man on the floor, around Park Chul, around the upended geometry of the space, and stopped in front of her in the doorway. He was close. He was looking at her face the way he'd been looking at her for 3 days with the thing he hadn't been saying. "You moved into the doorway," he said. "Yes?" "I told you not to go through any door before me." "I didn't go through it," she said. "I stood in it. There's a distinction." He looked at her for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. Short, exhausted, real. The most unguarded thing she'd heard from him in 3 years. "The bag," she said, looking past him. "Is that all of it?" "We'll verify." He turned back to the room. "Park." 3 drives, 2 folders, Park Chul said without looking up. The archived documentation that O was, yes. This is what he was after. Min-jae looked at the older man on the floor. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing. "Park's network," Min-jae said. Not a question. The man's silence confirmed it the way silence confirms things when the asker is already certain. "Is Junho Park still in Yoido?" Min-jae said. This to Park Chul. Park Chul checked his phone. "Team has eyes on the building. He hasn't moved." "O's daughter." "Still unconfirmed location, but the building in Yoido is residential. We think she's on site." Min-jae looked at the older man on the floor again. "If she's harmed," he said, "I want you to understand what that means for everyone who was in this room tonight." The man looked at the floor. Min-jae turned away from him. He looked at Amara. "We need to move." "Yoido," she said. "Yes." She looked at his arm one more time. "At least close the sleeve," she said. "Press it closed." He pushed the sleeve down over the cut without comment. She watched him do it. Then she turned toward the elevator and he came with her, and behind them she heard Park Chul beginning the process of securing the room and the men in it with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and would do it again. The drive to Yoido took 19 minutes. She spent most of it looking at her hands in her lap, and then looking at the city outside the window, and then looking at Min-jae's profile in the seat beside her, which she did briefly, and then redirected because she was still processing too many things simultaneously, and his face in this moment, tired, set, carrying the new weight of what Oh had told him about his father, was not a thing she could look at for long without it reaching somewhere she needed to stay clear of for the next hour. She thought about the message. His father's death. The cardiac event that wasn't. 3 years of working for this man and she hadn't known. She understood that this was the nature of the world she'd walked into. Knowledge was distributed deliberately, compartmentalized by design, and Min-jae himself hadn't known the full truth. But it sat in her differently than other unknown things had sat. More personal. Like a room in a house she thought she knew that turned out to have a different floor plan. She thought about Kim Tae-young's face when he'd said who gave the order, the way he'd looked at Min-jae. Not with hostility, with something more complicated. The look of a man who had decided that someone deserved to know a thing and was uncertain whether telling them was protection or damage. She needed to know the rest of that sentence. Whoever gave the order is still what? Still protected. Still in the organization. Still close. She filed it in the place she kept things that needed to be returned to. The Yewido building was residential, mid-rise, the kind that housed young professionals and the occasional family that hadn't yet moved to the more established neighborhoods. Min-jae's team had 2 cars already on the street when they arrived. She saw them as they pulled up, parked in positions that looked casual and were not. A man she didn't know came to the car window and spoke to Min-jae in rapid Korean. She caught pieces. 4th floor. 1 contact visible in the window. No movement in or out since surveillance established. Min-jae listened, nodded, got out of the car. She got out. He didn't tell her to stay this time. What happened in the Yewido building was not like the server room. It was not fast, and it was not physical, and it required a different kind of steadiness from her side, the kind she was actually better at. They went up in the elevator, Min-jae, Park Chul, 2 others, and her. 4th floor. Corridor that smelled like someone cooking late. A door at the far end with a line of light beneath it. Min-jae knocked. Not loudly, not urgently. He knocked the way someone knocks on a door they believe is about to open, and she understood what he was doing, not giving whoever was inside enough information from the sound to know what was coming. A man's voice from inside. Korean. Then silence. Then a woman's voice, younger, frightened but controlled, which told her Oh's daughter had something of her father's particular brand of composure. Min-jae spoke through the door. 3 sentences. She didn't have the language, but she had 3 years of reading him, and what she heard in the 3 sentences was not threat. It was a specific kind of honesty. She could hear it in the register and the pace, the flatness of someone who has decided the most useful thing is the true thing. A long silence. Then the sound of movement. Then the lock. The man who opened the door was not one of Junho Park's trained people. He was perhaps 22, with the look of someone doing this for money rather than conviction, scared in the way that people doing things for money get scared when the thing becomes real. He looked at Min-jae and took a step back. A young woman was sitting on the couch behind him. She had her arms crossed over her chest, and she looked at Min-jae with the specific look of someone who has been trying very hard not to be afraid and is relieved to have somewhere to redirect that effort. Min-jae said something to her. She stood up immediately. The young man by the door made a decision. She saw him making it, the brief calculation in his face. And then he put his hands up and stepped aside, and Park Chul moved past her and secured the situation in the efficient way Park Chul secured situations. And it was done. Oh's daughter, her name was So Yeon, she learned later, walked out of the apartment and past Amara in the corridor with the specific dignity of someone choosing how to carry a bad experience. And Amara looked at her and said quietly, "You're all right." So Yeon looked at her. "Yes," she said in English, and something in her face said she was deciding to believe that. Junho Park was taken into custody, not by any official agency, not that night, at his primary Seoul residence at 2 in the morning. She wasn't there for that. She was at the Mapo location, sitting at the central table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, going through the documentation from the bag with 2 of Min-jae's people, cross-referencing it against the subsidiary records she'd traced herself 2 nights ago. The picture that assembled itself was not simple. The order for Chairman Kong's death had not come from Junho Park. Park had discovered it, had spent years assembling evidence of it the way Min-jae's people assembled things, patiently and from multiple angles, and had used it as the foundation of his entire strategy. Not to expose it, not out of anything like justice, to leverage it, to hold it over the person who'd given the order and create a permanent position for himself. A man who knew too much to be removed, who had the documentation to prove it, who could make the whole thing surface or keep it buried according to what served him. The person who had given the order was still in the organization. She found the name at 4:17 in the morning. She sat with it for 30 seconds. Then she got up and found Min-jae. He was in the side room, alone, seated at a small table with his jacket off and a glass of water in front of him that he wasn't drinking. He looked like a man who had been sitting with something difficult for several hours and had moved past the difficult part into the open territory on the other side of it. The place that doesn't have a feeling yet, just a new configuration of facts. She sat across from him. She put the folder on the table between them. She put her finger on the name, not pointing, just resting there, marking it, and she looked at him. He looked at the name. She watched his face. She watched it receive the information, process it, go through 3 distinct things in perhaps 4 seconds. Then it settled into the stillness she'd seen in the server room, the one that was doing serious work. Director O. The man who had known for 11 months, the man who had managed what Min-jae was told, the man who had stood in this building earlier tonight and said, "I made a decision about what you needed to know with the face of someone delivering overdue information rather than confessing to the origin of the need." O hadn't been protecting Min-jae. He'd been protecting himself. Managing the evidence of his own involvement in the death of the man Min-jae had built everything to honor. Keeping close, staying necessary, guiding information to ensure the truth stayed in a shape that never quite pointed back far enough. Min-jae looked at the name for a long time. She didn't say anything. There was nothing she could offer that was adequate to this particular moment, and she'd learned long ago that inadequate offerings were worse than silence. She just stayed in the chair across from him and let the room be what it was. Finally, he said, "How certain?" The financial trail connects O to the medical practice directly. It's in his personal accounts, not his business accounts, personal, routed through a property holding in Busan. She paused. It's not circumstantial. It's specific. He was quiet. There's more, she said. The documentation Park had, the evidence Park assembled about your father, some of it came from O. O gave Park the confirmation he needed to make the leverage viable. I thought he was buying protection. She paused. He gave the man who hated your organization the tools to threaten it in exchange for staying safe inside it. Min-jae closed the folder. He didn't speak for a while. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the building she could hear muffled voices, the machinery of the aftermath continuing without them. 3 years, he said finally. She understood he meant more than 3 years. He meant the specific 3 years she had been inside this building, inside his orbit, while O had been in there too. The geometry of that. Yes, she said. He looked at her. You found it. I found the thread. The accounting team will have to verify the full. You found it, he said again. Not as accounting, as something else. She met his eyes. Someone had to look at the right numbers, she said. I know which numbers to look at. Something in his face shifted, moved, settled, arrived somewhere. She'd watched his face for 3 years, and she knew most of its positions, and this one was not one of the familiar ones. It was something that had been underneath the familiar ones, and was now, for the first time, at the surface. I owe you an apology, he said. She waited. When I came to your office the morning of the flowers, he said, and I took them without explaining, and then I had you sit in that building all morning not knowing. He held her gaze. I decided what you needed to know, the same thing O decided. I didn't see it that way at the time. He paused. I see it now. She absorbed this. The comparison he was making between himself and O was not one she would have made, but she understood why he made it. He was someone who held himself to a standard that didn't have much tolerance for self-exception. It's not the same thing, she said, isn't it? O managed information to protect himself, she said. You managed it because you were trying to manage everything around me while you figured out what I meant to you. She paused. Those are different problems. He was quiet for a moment. What you meant to me, he said. He repeated it the way you repeat something that has landed strangely, not doubting it, just feeling the shape of it. Min-jae. She said it the way she'd said it in the car, the way she said it when it was just for him. We've been not saying something for long enough that it's gotten heavy. I'd like to put it down now. He looked at her. She held his gaze steadily, the way she'd held Junho Park's gaze across a restaurant table, but entirely differently. Without strategy, without calibration, without anything folded or managed, just directly. I have been in love with you, she said, for approximately 2 years. I've been very careful and very professional about it. And I've told myself a number of reasonable things about why it was correct to stay careful and professional. Tonight I ran into a building I didn't know the safety status of because you were going there, and I think that takes the reasonable things off the table. He was very still. I'm not telling you because I expect it to be returned, she said. I'm telling you because I said I was done with things being kept in places where they couldn't be looked at directly, and I meant myself too. She put her hands flat on the table, the same gesture she'd seen him use, she realized, and almost smiled at recognizing it. So, there it is. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over both of hers. Not gripping, just there, warm and specific and present. I came to your office the morning of the flowers, he said slowly, and I saw them on your desk, and the thing I felt was not security concern. He paused. It was jealousy, which I had no right to feel, which I wasn't prepared to feel, which is why I took them and left without saying anything, because I didn't have language for what was happening, and I didn't trust myself to speak without the language. He looked at their hands. I've been not saying something for approximately 2.5 years. She let that sit in the room. You're ahead of me by 6 months, she said. His thumb moved across her knuckles. Once. The smallest gesture she'd ever seen from him, and therefore the largest. I should have said it before all this, he said. I should have. We both should have, she said. It doesn't matter when. It matters. Then it matters that we're saying it now. She turned her hand under his so it was palm up, and she held his hand the way you hold a thing you've decided to keep. That's enough. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Director O was taken into custody the following morning. Min-jae did it himself, walked into the holding space where O had been kept overnight, and sat across from him and said the name of the medical practice in Busan, and set the financial documentation on the table and waited. O looked at it for a long time. Then he said, I told myself I was protecting the organization. I know, Min-jae said. After it was done, after your father, I spent 6 months believing that. I made myself believe it was operational, that it was the right call for the survival of. I know how it works, Min-jae said. I know how you tell that story to yourself. His voice was not angry. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. I know because I've spent 12 years telling myself versions of that story about other things. He paused. The difference is what the story is covering. O looked at the table. You were the closest person to my father at the end, Min-jae said. He trusted you specifically. O said nothing. I won't pretend, Min-jae said, that I know exactly what it will cost me to deal with this the way it needs to be dealt with. But I know I'm going to deal with it. He stood up. And I know that if I let it stay covered because covering it is easier, I become something I've spent 12 years trying not to become. He walked out of the room. He walked past Amara, who was standing in the corridor, and who had been standing there for the past 15 minutes without him asking her to and without her explaining why. And when he came even with her, he slowed and she fell into step beside him, and they walked down the corridor together without speaking. Outside, the Seoul morning was doing the things Seoul mornings did, asserting itself, loud and indifferent, the city already fully in motion by 8:30 despite everything that had happened to specific people within it overnight. The light was the cold, clear light of a city that had been rained on and dried and was now proceeding without comment. They stood at the entrance of the building for a moment. O will be turned over to the relevant authorities, Min-jae said. With full documentation, we'll cooperate with the investigation. That will create exposure for the organization, she said. Yes. The legitimate operation specifically. Yes. You've thought about that. I've thought about that. He looked at the street. I've thought about the fact that I've spent 12 years building something my father started, and I've been protecting it from the wrong threats." He paused. The threat that needed the most attention was always internal. He looked at her. "You told me that. Not in words. But you've been showing me the internal threats for 3 years, and I've been looking outward." She considered this. "I was doing my job." "You were doing considerably more than your job." She accepted that. What happens to Junho Park? The evidence we have, what he did to So-yeon, the infiltration of the organization, his network's role in my father's case, that goes to authorities as well. His operation is finished. His leverage is gone. He paused. He built 12 years around a secret that's no longer a secret. He'll try to negotiate. He has nothing left to negotiate with. She thought about Junho Park sitting at that restaurant table in the moment when the doors opened. The terrible, specific stillness of a man, understanding that his foundation was never there. She didn't feel satisfaction about it, exactly. Something more complicated. The acknowledgement that intelligence and patience and years of preparation are not protection against the wrong premise. He'd been wrong about her. That was the premise he'd built on. And he'd been wrong not because she was stronger or sharper or more prepared than he'd calculated. He'd been wrong because he'd looked at an overlooked woman in a powerful man's orbit and seen leverage. And what he'd actually found was the one person in that building who understood the whole of it, all the layers, all the pressures, all the human machinery underneath the organizational structure, and who had chosen, with full information, to be there. That wasn't a weakness he could exploit. It never had been. 3 weeks later, Amara moved offices. Not far. 2 floors up, which in the geography of the Baekryong building was significant in a specific way that everyone on every floor immediately understood and nobody commented on directly. Her new office had a window that looked south over the Han River, which she hadn't asked for and which she stood in front of on the first morning for longer than was strictly productive. Her title changed. Not to something dramatic. She'd never been interested in dramatic titles, which were, in her experience, frequently inversely proportional to actual authority. It was specific and accurate, Director of Strategic Operations, which described what she'd been doing for 3 years without the description. She still dropped things occasionally. A pen. Her building badge twice in the first week. The muscle memory of being a specific kind of person didn't change because her business cards did. She'd made peace with that long ago, and the peace was genuine. What changed was subtler. She stopped apologizing for things that weren't her fault. She'd been doing it so long. The reflexive sorry that smoothed friction in a space where she'd always been aware of being both essential and unexpected, that she hadn't noticed it as a habit until it started to feel wrong. The day she caught herself beginning to apologize for asking a reasonable question in a meeting and stopped herself mid-syllable and simply asked the question, she went back to her office afterward and sat at her desk and laughed. Not long, just once. The laugh of recognizing something that had been right there. The investigation into Chairman Kang's death proceeded through the appropriate channels. It was slow, as these things are, and it was difficult, as these things are. And there were days when Min-jae came back from meetings with lawyers and investigators with the specific exhausted blankness of someone who has been describing a wound for hours and is tired of the description. She didn't try to fix those evenings. She learned that some things are better witnessed than fixed, and that choosing to witness something costs more than it looks like from the outside. Director Oh was formally charged. The proceedings were ongoing. She read the updates the way she read most things, completely, with attention, making notes on a legal pad that she kept in her desk drawer. Kim Tae-young was handled differently. Min-jae made a decision that she knew cost him something, a specific kind of pride, the kind that lives near the concept of betrayal. And he made it in a room with just the two of them, saying it out loud as a way of making it real. Kim had been wrong. The method had been wrong. But the belief underneath it, that someone in the organization should have known the truth about Chairman Kang and acted on it, was not entirely wrong. Min-jae said this with the voice of someone removing a splinter that has been in too long. Kim was gone from the organization. There would be no further action. Junho Park's operation collapsed efficiently once the documentation went public and the network connections were exposed. He retained his lawyers and began the long process of negotiating his position, which was considerably weaker than he'd have liked. She read about it once in a business publication that covered the story without the full context and found the half version of events oddly peaceful. Some things could stay partially visible. Not everything needed to be fully exposed to be resolved. So Yeon. Oh sent her a message 6 weeks after Yewido. She didn't know how So Yeon got her contact. She had some suspicions, and the message was short. Thank you for what you said in the corridor. I've been trying to believe it. Amara read it on her phone at her desk in her new office with the river window. She wrote back, keep going. That's all it is. She wasn't sure it was wisdom. It was just what she knew sad. 4 months after the night at Cheongdam House, Min-jae took her to a rooftop. Not the Baekryong building, a different one, residential, in a neighborhood she didn't know he had any connection to until he parked in front of it and got out of the car like he'd been here before. It was a clear night, November, cold enough that her breath was visible. The city spread in every direction, ordinary and vast and lit in the particular way of cities at night, which she'd always found beautiful in the unsentimental way that actual beautiful things are beautiful. They stood at the railing and looked at it. She'd brought coffee in a thermos because she'd known somehow that they'd be outside, and she poured 2 cups and gave him one, and they stood there with the warmth in their hands and the cold on their faces, and the city below them being what it was. My father used to bring me here, Min-jae said. She looked at him. Not this building specifically, this neighborhood. We'd walk on Saturday mornings when I was young. He was looking at the city. Before the organization became what it became, before it was anything he needed to manage carefully. He paused. I've been trying to remember what that was like. Before everything required management. She held her coffee cup with both hands. What was it like? He thought about it. Simple, he said. Not easy, just simple. He said whatever he was thinking. We'd walk until we were tired and then we'd eat something and go home. He paused. I haven't been back to this neighborhood in 12 years. What made you come back now? He looked at her. The look he'd been giving her since the Mapo location, since she'd put her hands on the table and said the true thing. The look that was no longer being managed, that she'd stopped trying to interpret and had started simply receiving. I've been making a list, he said, of the things I stopped doing because the organization required a different version of me. The list is longer than I'd like. What's on it? Saturday mornings, he said. Saying what I'm thinking in the moment I'm thinking it. He paused. Letting someone be close enough that losing them would matter. She looked at the city for a moment. I'm already close enough, she said. You already lost the option of this not mattering. I know, he said. I'm not trying to get it back. He looked at her. I'm trying to build something that accounts for it, that doesn't require you to stand at the edge of what I'm doing while I figure things out in the center of it. She turned toward him. The cold air was making her eyes water slightly, which she was choosing to attribute to the cold air. What does that look like? I don't know yet, he said. I know it looks different from the last 12 years. He held her gaze. I know it involves asking instead of deciding. She looked at him for a long moment. The man she'd spent 3 years learning the shape of, from the outside. The jaw set, the underwater look, the 47-second response time when something reached him somewhere real. She was still learning the inside of it. She thought she would be for a long time, and found that she did not mind this at all. Then ask something, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The city moved below them, indifferent and alive. Stay, he said. Not in the building, not in the organization, with me. He said it simply, without architecture, without the careful structure he usually put around things he needed to say. Whatever shape this becomes, the legitimate operations, the work I still have to do to make this organization something worth working for, I want to do it with you in the center of it, not at the edge. He paused. I should have asked you that before I assumed you'd stay. I'm asking now. She stood there with her coffee going cold in her hands, and the November air, and the city, and this man who had taken her flowers off her desk 4 months ago because someone else had sent them, and he hadn't been prepared for what that meant. And she thought about 3 years of folding things carefully and putting them in small places, and she thought about a woman who dropped things and apologized too much, and had walked into a cold, controlled world and stayed in it because she'd recognized something worth staying for. She'd been right. Yes, she said. He exhaled. One breath, longer than a normal breath. The breath of something being put down. She poured more coffee into both their cups, and they stood at the railing as the city went on below them, ordinary and continuous, the way cities go on. The light of Seoul moved in its patterns. The Han River caught pieces of it and gave them back in broken reflections. The cold was real, and the warmth in her hands was real, and the man beside her was real in the specific way that things are real when you've stopped needing them to be anything other than what they are. She was not someone people wrote stories about. She'd always known that. She stood on a rooftop in November and looked at the city she'd made her life in and thought, maybe that was never the right measure. Maybe the right measure was different. Was the specific evidence of a life examined and chosen. Was the particular warmth of standing somewhere high and looking down at the world you've decided to be in. Min-jae's hand found hers at the railing. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. They both looked at the city, and that was enough, and it was the right thing, and neither of them needed to say so. Below them, Seoul moved in its old, indifferent way. Above it, two people stood in the cold and held on.